Hi everyone and welcome back. So today I wanted to do another tutorial. I've missed doing these for the last few weeks and I wanted to get back into it and just cover a topic which a lot of you asked me about on Instagram, and that is how to improve your mix. So with it being such a massive topic and you all using different instruments, writing different parts and probably doing different genres, I decided to narrow it down and I've come up with 5 key points, tips that I use in every one of my mixes and should overall help you to get that cleaner mix that you're looking for. Before we start, I just wanted to say that for me personally, something that I've struggled with for the last couple of years is I've been trying to get my mixes so clean that I've almost sucked the life out of them. And coming from a more dance and DJ background, a track with a better feel and a better vibe to it that isn't mixed quite so well is always going to get a hell of a lot more support than something with less of a good feel to it but that is mixed perfectly. And I think that's really good to keep in mind when you're writing anything and when you're mixing anything. For me especially, if I can get something to kind of 95% of where I want to get it to, but it's still got a good feel to it, then that's enough. I don't really want to push it much beyond that. And it's good, it takes the pressure off you when you're mixing and trying to get everything clinical and perfect. So that's something to bear in mind, but I've got a project loaded up behind me, which is my track Wasting My Time, which I put out a couple of months ago, and I'll show you my tips now. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is EQing in your mix. It's probably one of the most common things that we all use when we're mixing. And my tip 1 is to use cuts rather than boosts. Now, obviously there will be some scenarios where a boost may work better, but I wanted to talk about why I feel that cuts can be a lot more beneficial when you're mixing rather than boosting everything. So in this track, I've got a piano here, which is being sent to my keys bus, and then I've got all my vocals here. And this is an area of the mix which I often have to do this technique on, just because the vocals and the pianos can come through around the same frequency in the mix. So the easiest thing that most people will kind of jump to is if they load up an EQ. Any EQ on here will work, so I've just picked the Logic one. They will normally take the area that they want to stand out in the vocals. So in a vocal, normally around 2.5K is where they will boost, and they'll push it up. Now, the reason this quite often doesn't work is if you think of the reason that you're doing it is because there's too many frequencies in that range and you want something to stand out. So by boosting it, you're actually just adding more frequencies into that range, which in a lot of instances won't sort the issue on its own. So what I find is kind of a better thing to do is if I was to take this same EQ, if I just copy it here, and then I'm just going to bypass it on the screen, and I'm just going to add the same EQ plugin onto my keys and just hit paste. So this is the EQ that we would have done on the vocal. Now, for me, a much more effective way to get those vocals to stand out is often to inverse that EQ. So here we've got plus 2 dB, which we would have added, and instead we're going to take out 2 dB of the pianos themselves. Now what that's going to do is it's actually going to take out frequencies from that range, and it's probably going to mean that you don't need to do an awful lot to your vocals. You're not going to need to change the volumes, and they should pop out in the mix on their own. Obviously, you've got to remember that if you put a flat EQ on and you've got your vocal coming through at 5 dB, if you then boost that, that is going to get louder overall. So you're going to have to start changing levels as well. So I find that it's much better to be cutting EQs instead. The same can be in the bass end of the track. So for instance, I've got a bass here. If I load up my EQ on that, you'll see that I've got a cut off here. Now the reason I'm cutting that off is because my sub is coming in underneath and that is covering those frequencies anyway. So I kind of don't need them in there. So that was tip 1, use cuts. You can use inverse EQs. So let's say your bass is also getting in the way of your vocals. If it goes really high up in the frequency range, then you can do the exact same thing. You can just inverse that EQ and just pull it down in the same area just to give those vocals a little bit more room. And for me, this is a really easy technique which can instantly make your mixes sound that little bit cleaner. Tip 2 is going to sound a little bit weird, and it's probably going to sound quite obvious to some people, but it was to say to mix with your ears. Now, what I mean with that is nowadays we have lots of fancy plugins, which is great. If I load up my EQ, for instance, you've got your analyzers, which typically bounce around while you're EQing your track. Now, although that is a great thing to have, it can also be detrimental in the fact that people will jump to that as their first port of call. What I would probably say is your first port of call should be not having your analyzer on and cutting what you think you need to cut out. If you do struggle to find a frequency and things like that, it can be really, really helpful. But actually just remembering to use your ears rather than what you're seeing on screen is much, much better. Now, as some of you can see in front of me, I've got this mixer. This is just a controller for Logic, and it is used for exactly that. It's to take my eyes off the screen and mix just using the faders. A lot of times on Instagram and things like that, I'll get questions saying, what decibel do you have your kick at? Where's your fader? All that kind of thing. And my honest answer is I have no idea. Every track I do, I will just mix it as it is, and I won't look at what numbers they're on. I think it's really easy to get caught up on whether it's at -6 or -5.3, when actually just making that decision by ear is going to be a lot better. And going back to my very first comment about getting a good feel in your track, you're going to get a better feel if you're mixing with your ears than you're looking in screen. One thing I do want to say, there are times when using visual stuff can be really useful. For me, I tend to use it as a quick check more than anything. So let's say I'm sat here and I'm mixing for quite a long period of time. I will often use tonal balance, which is by iZotope. And as long as my mix is within this kind of tube here, then it's a quick check to see, is the bass where it needs to be, or are the highs roughly where they need to be, and then I can close that and carry on with my mix, and it kind of resets me for that. But other than that, most of the time I'll try and avoid it. And for those of you who are using Logic, a really easy way to try and do this is once you've arranged your track and you've got it in front of you, obviously looking at the arrangement window, you can kind of expect things to come in just because you can see it ahead of time. Now, your listener isn't going to have that kind of advantage. They're going to be listening on an MP3, so things might sound a lot more abrupt to them than to you when you're watching the timeline kind of move across. So a really easy way to do it, at the top of your screen, you've got screen sets. So at the moment, mine's set to number 1, and if I press number 1 on my keyboard, that is how it will load. And if you look at this camera, you'll notice on the left hand side I've got my mixer out the way, and then I have the arrange window in front of me. Now if you press 2 on your keyboard, you can set your screen set to be different. So I'll write a track like this, and the minute I want to mix, I will press number 2 and it will bring up my mixer on here. Now you could have your arrange window at the side if you wanted. You could just not have it at all like I've got set up now. But it's just a really good way to kind of take you out of using your eyes and seeing what's coming and preparing yourself that way, and actually just listening to the music, and all you've got to go by then is the faders to actually mix your track. If you've got a laptop, a nice way to do it is if you put 2 fingers on your trackpad over the fader, you can literally push it up and down like it was a normal fader. And I'll use that if I'm at home on headphones. I'll pull it all the way down, probably look away from the screen, and then just push that fader up until it sounds like it's roughly at the right volume in the track. Now, the third thing that I wanted to cover is more of a technique, and it's called gain staging, and I mentioned it very briefly in one of my track tutorials. I thought today would be a good time to go into a little bit more depth with it. And what it basically is. So gain staging, the easiest way to think about it, if you were in a studio and you were on a desk, you would probably do this naturally, like you would with your interface. So if you were recording vocals, you would record them at kind of the perfect volume, and then you would tweak it from there. You wouldn't record them really, really loud and then try and turn them all down in the mix. You wouldn't want it distorting and that kind of thing. And it's the same in your DAW, but it's just not as easy to kind of see. So if I look at my track here, I'm just going to turn this off because I've already got it turned on. You could have a look on the tracks. And at first glance, it looks like everything is well within where it needs to be. So you can see here, I mean, this one is at -10, is where it's peaking. This one's at -12, and it all looks great. Now, the problem with this is that this is actually showing you what's happening after your fader. So if I was to turn this down, it will also turn down here. Now, the reason that can be a problem is if I go to splice, for instance, and just grab any sample. I'm just going to grab a kick just to drag in to demonstrate. And we've just got a Mark Knight one here. Now, there's a kind of loudness war on splice to get all the samples sounding as loud as possible. So if I just solo this kick, let's just solo that and show you the track on here. So I'm just going to solo it and press play. And you can see over here, that's actually peaking at 0. So that is essentially where your track would be peaking once it's mastered. So this is like dragging a mastered sample into Logic. Now, if I was to pull this fader up and down, initially it looks great. We're now at -14.8. But the problem is that is showing me what's happening after I've moved this fader. If I actually look at the sample that's coming in at the top, where you're going to put your effects, you'll see that it's actually still at the same volume it was at before. So a way in Logic to check this, I found this the other day, and if you right click at the top on Customize Control Bar, you can add in Pre-Fader Metering, and this is going to show you the volume of the sample before your fader. So if you click this here, and then I play the same sample, even with the fader down here, you'll see that that sample's still mastered. It's still coming in at kind of 0 dB. So the way that you can combat that, there's two ways depending on whether it's audio or MIDI. But if it's an audio file here, you can go up to the gain in the top. If you can't see it, just open up this box. And I'm just going to hit -12. Now you'll notice this actually got a lot smaller at the same time, the actual waveform. So I'll just show you that again. So that's what it was originally, and that's what we now have. And if I press play, you'll see that that track is now at -12 when it's coming in. Now, a lot of you at this point are probably wondering why the hell we'd go to all this effort just to get it at the right volume in there. And the reason being, any of these effects that Logic has built in, so let's say EQs or compressors is a really good example. You've got all these different styles, and each of these is mimicking a hardware unit that used to exist, whether it's an SSL compressor or a Drawmer compressor. And what it's doing is anything that compressor used to do, it's trying to emulate that. So when it was outboard, they used to need the signal to be going into them between, I think it was -18 and -12 dB to get the best sound out of it. If you cranked it up and had it going in at 0 dB, your compressor is going to sound awful. And obviously, because these are replicating that, these are going to sound the same if you throw in a sample that's coming in at 0 dB. It's going to make the track sound awful. And if you then put that into an EQ, you're doing the same thing, and then add another effect and so on. You're just layering up all these different plugins which aren't running at their kind of optimal performance. So by bringing this down in volume, it's going to come into the compressor where the compressor's sweet spot is and where it's going to work the best. And as long as you make sure that your input gain and your output gain is matched, you know that every plugin you add, it's going to have the same effect, and they're all going to be running at optimal. And I got told to do this by a mix engineer, and since I've done it, you end up with so much more headroom in your mix when you're coming to like compressing it and mastering it at the end. And overall, your track just sounds so much better because it's something that you're applying to every single track that you're doing. And the other nice thing is, instead of having all your faders down here, which you'll notice you have to have quite a lot of the time, your faders are up here where you have a lot more scope to kind of dial in those sounds. I did mention there was one other way to do it. That is just audio that we've talked about. A quick example, if you had your piano, for instance, and it was far too loud, all you need to do is in your synth or your sampler, you can turn down the volume on here as well. My fourth tip is about giving things space in your mix. And what I mean by that is everyone thinks of things going from low frequencies to highs, which is great, but less people when they're mixing think about width and depth into the speakers as well. And it's really simple to do, but if you listen to like tracks that have been mixed by huge mix engineers, they will often sound really wide and really, really full, deep into the speakers, not just kind of from top to bottom. They don't sound like they're in mono. And it's really, really easy to do. So if I take my topper, for instance, this is all of the drums that I have apart from my kick. If I load up my mixer, so in terms of the width, obviously panning is probably the easiest way to do this. So you can see here, all of these, well, majority of these drums are ever so slightly panned either left or right. Now I saw this on a Disciples video, and that's how they do it, and literally every sound will be dialed left or right, and straight away your mix will just have a huge amount of width. There are other ways to do this as well. There's like stereo imaging plugins, which can be great if you want the sound to kind of spread evenly into each speaker. But for instance, my ride here, I have slightly left, the same with my shaker. And what you can do is if you have, say, a clap and it sounds a little bit thin, you can layer another clap under it, which naturally the sample is spread a bit more. And if you have a ride, let's say here, and it's taking up loads of space in the mix, but you want to direct it really accurately into your left speaker, actually, if you put it into mono by clicking here rather than stereo, rather than moving it like this in your mix, you're going to kind of put it in mono and then accurately place that in your mix, and that will have a huge impact on the width of your mix. Now, the other thing I mentioned with giving it space is the depth as well. So naturally our ears, wherever we are, if I'm in the studio talking, there's going to be a natural reverb on my voice, and our ears know that if there's more reverb on something, it's likely to be further away. So you can use that to your advantage. You can use it to be really creative. If you want something to move from the back to the front, you can throw loads of reverb on it and then gradually bring that off, and it will come to the front of the speakers. And if you've got stuff at the same frequencies as well, that can be a really, really useful thing. So if you want your backing vocals further back than your like lead vocals, that's something you can do. And another thing with that is you obviously want things to sound natural. So you can see here, these are all my drums, and they're all going ever so slightly to bus one. And what that's going to mean is all of those drums sound like they're in the same room. You don't want your snare drum sounding like it's in a hall, and then your, I don't know, your clap sounding like it's in a small room, because it's unnatural and it will sound really odd in the mix. So yeah, using those two techniques of like panning, spreading stuff, and then also using your reverbs is going to make your mix have a lot more depth. It's going to give it some life. Quite often producing on computers all the time, you'll find it sounds very computerized, for want of a better word, and it doesn't have as much life to it as if you were live recording stuff. So doing this kind of thing with reverbs is going to add that back into the track. Now, my final point, so tip 5, is a very basic one, and it is literally just to reference. There's a good reason why these top mix engineers are paid a fortune to mix these tracks, and normally they can have like 20 years experience. You might find the track then goes to a mastering engineer which has the same amount of experience in mastering, and I think that's a great way for us to learn and to take tips from. It's also a really easy way to reset your ears. If you're in a studio and all you're listening to is your track over and over and over again, your ears kind of adjust to that and you assume that's how it should sound, when actually refreshing your ears, taking breaks, and then coming back and listening to a reference track that you want it to sound like is key to kind of resetting you and making you realise where your mix might be lacking or where things are spread slightly more. And I think that's key just in improving, listening to as many tracks as possible, listening to how they've done it kind of critically. Is my bass at the same level that reference track is, or not, and things like that. So those are my 5 tips. Tip 1 is cutting rather than boosting with your EQ. Tip 2 is to mix using your ears. Try and get away from looking at everything on the screen and kind of mix how you feel it sounds right. 3 is to gain stage, giving stuff space in the mix and making it sound a little bit more alive. And then last of all, just referencing can be really, really powerful. So thank you for tuning in. I appreciate this might be a lot longer than I initially anticipated, but hopefully you found it helpful. And any feedback you have, anything you want to know a little bit more about, please just let me know.